Hello and welcome to this video about humanism. In 1550, the Italian historian Giorgio Vasari wrote that humanity in the Middle Ages was so far removed from the truth as light is removed from darkness. According to Vasari, that truth was slowly being recovered from the 14th century onwards, because of the rediscovery of classical antiquity. But what changed exactly, and what aspects of society were affected by this change? And why were our early modern people inspired by classical antiquity? One of the first men to take classical antiquity as an explicit example was Francesco Petrarca, an Italian writer and poet from the 14th century. He was inspired by Cicero, a Roman orator who lived in the 1st century BC. Petrarca admired Cicero's ability to reach into men's hearts with his words and prompt them to action. Petrarca tried to do the same thing with his own texts. The ancient Greek and Roman texts were also studied from a new perspective. Via the Arabs who lived in Spain, these classical texts about science, philosophy, or literature became widespread in Europe once more. European scholars studied and commented on them a lot. But according to Petrarca, most scholars only had theoretical knowledge, which he found useless. It is quite pointless, for example, to know what virtue means if you do not try to live virtuously. So, what Petrarca was really after was practical knowledge, to live well in the here and now, which was, according to Petrarca, particularly to be found in the time of the Roman Republic. Of course, Petrarca idealized classical antiquity. But he was not alone. Many Italian scholars did exactly the same. They all had a new image of man, namely that man is able to control his own behavior. This persuasion started to grow in Italy in the 14th century. Man had a will of his own and the ability to know the truth. Man was master of his own fate. It was no surprise that Italy was the birthplace of the idealization of antiquity and the new image of man. The ruins and remains of the Roman Empire were still there. Moreover, after 1453, the year of the fall of Constantinople, many Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, which brought Greek antiquity a bit closer. Petrarca and other Italian scholars called themselves Humanists. This term was derived from the Latin humanitas, humanity, a term that Cicero had also discussed. Language, Cicero wrote, is what distinguishes man from animal, and for this reason alone the study of language was important. Humanist studies, also called the Studia Humanitatis, were centered around 5 disciplines or artes: grammar, rhetoric, or the art of giving speeches, poetry, history, and philosophy. Education, and particularly the study of the classics, was very special to the humanists, because it made man's self-development possible. The Studia Humanitatis could be followed in academies, colleges, and so-called Latin schools. Latin schools were to be found in Florence, where they were paid for by the wealthy and powerful Medici family, but they could also be found in other cities. During the 15th century, humanist ideas spread from Italy to the rest of Europe. In 1517, the Collegium Trilingue was founded in Leuven, where you could study all 3 biblical languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Similar colleges were established in Spain, France, and Germany. Humanists from all over Europe had a solid network. They visited each other, sent letters to each other, and studied or taught at each other's colleges. Their network was still very elitist. Only those who could afford to study were privileged enough to participate. Even though humanism was elitist, the humanist ideas would have a great impact, and not only on education, but also on religion, politics, and art. The same recipe was used in all these aspects, renewal inspired by antiquity. The humanist motto was ad fontes, back to the sources. Humanism put man center stage, with the emphasis on man as an individual. but this did not keep humanists from being interested in religion. For example, Thomas More, an English humanist, and Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam were unhappy with the way things went in the Catholic Church. Just as they wanted to reform the individual by means of practical knowledge and virtue, they wanted to reform the Church. According to Thomas More and Erasmus, the Church had given in to money and power, and had thus betrayed her roots. The purely theoretical knowledge and outward appearances had to make way for a simple, practical, and personal faith. Erasmus, for example, wrote a new Latin translation of the Bible, which, according to him, was much closer to the original text than the existing translations. In 1501, Erasmus published an Enchiridion, a manual with practical suggestions for one's personal religious life. However, Erasmus and Thomas More would not have much sympathy for the Protestant reformers who broke away from the Catholic Church, whereas Erasmus and More wanted to reform the Church from the inside. Humanists were also interested in politics. Thomas More, for example, published a book entitled Utopia, which describes a fictional perfect society with religious tolerance and neither poverty nor hunger. Another humanist who wrote about politics was the Italian statesman Nicolo Machiavelli, who dreamt of a strong government, which would ensure safety and order. In his book Il Principe, or The Prince, he declared that the end justifies the means. Hence, according to Machiavelli, a state leader should be allowed to use violence or manipulation. It is much safer to be feared than loved, he thought. This word cloud gives you an overview of the most important things that were just discussed. You can press pause to have a closer look at it. Don't forget to fill in the Google Forms, and thanks for watching!